hue saturation value. This is an example of a digital art color picker, right? And this is what's called an HSV. So it has your hues. So your hues are on the right-hand side over here. And then your values are over here, right? Light to dark. And your saturation goes this way, goes horizontally.
Hue, saturation, and value, if you think about it like a pie, your hue is really your color or your chroma. Your saturation is how bright or dull that color is, and value is how light or dark something is. So black being the darkest and white being the lightest. And then if you start to apply color to value, you're going to get a wider value range, which will help you get better contrast.
So there's contrast in hue, contrast in saturation, and contrast in value. So this is an example of hues, and you can see that I've just changed the hue. They're the same vividness, the same brightness, except the hue has completely changed. So this is an example of hue, and basically hue is also known as color, and it's also known as chroma. Right? So a color wheel is an example of hue, and if you think of like Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe pieces, right? That's all him exploring hue.
So I'm going to demonstrate how to change hue, saturation, and value in painting. So this painting was from my painting mentorship class, and it's done in gouache, and I intended it to be fully saturated and using an analogous color palette. So as you learned before, analogous colors are not the highest contrast in hue because they're next to each other on the color wheel. So this painting has high contrast in value and pretty high contrast in saturation because that purple really sticks out, right? Compared with everything else, buildings are not usually purple, right? Buildings are usually brown, they're usually mud colors. So in this case, this building really stands out. So this painting has more contrast in value and saturation than hue. But I'm going to show you how to change your hue, saturation, and value. You can do this in Photoshop. I'm doing this in Medibang, but usually in any photo editing software, you are able to change it. I'm going to hit Control U, and you will see a hue, saturation, brightness window pop up. So I'm just going to bring this down to right below my face here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the hue. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. I'm going to adjust the hue. So see what happens when I start to adjust the hue. So you can see that the color of everything starts to change, right? All of the colors start to change, but they all change together relative to each other. Now, I might explore hue here and say, I actually really like how this piece looks like this, and I can save it. So I do this a lot when I want to explore ways I can use hue differently, right? So for example, I really like the painting right now because it's this has more contrast in hue because the yellow and purple are actually opposite colors. So right now this painting has a lot of contrast in hue, whereas before the original did not. So if I wanted to adjust saturation, I can do the same thing. So if I move the slider down, you'll see that it becomes less saturated. And if I move this slider up, you will see that it becomes super saturated. So when it's super saturated like this, you get eye strain, right? It's almost difficult to look at because it's just vibrating. Now, super saturated colors don't really work as well in CMYK than they do in RGB, because in RGB, you have a much wider gamut. So you have a larger range of colors than in CMYK, but we'll learn about that in a separate video. So if I want to, reduce my saturation, you can kind of see now the painting is very muted. It looks kind of nostalgic. But if I wanted to increase the saturation, it looks very bright, very happy. So happier pictures are generally more saturated, and serious pictures or more naturally lit pictures are generally less saturated. So if I wanted the piece to look a bit more natural, I might desaturate it. And if I want it to look super happy and super bright, then I might add a lot of saturation. Okay, so if I wanted to change the contrast of saturation in a painting, I'm actually going to show you how to digitally manipulate it in Medibang or any photo editing program. So right now I can choose which part of my piece I want to be the most saturated. So it makes sense that the building, which is currently already the most saturated, remains the most saturated. So now I have just my building selected. So what I can do right now is I can inverse my selection. So I just go to select, inverse, and now it's selecting everything that is outside my previous selection. So if I select inverse, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control U on my hue, saturation, and brightness pop-up here where I can adjust the hue. So I'm going to turn the saturation of everything else around that building down. So I'm going to turn it way down and hit OK. And then when I deselect, you will see that the building is the only thing that is saturated. So this creates contrast through saturation. Okay, so lastly, brightness. So to adjust the value, you actually use something called levels. So what brightness does is it just shifts your white point. So if I brought the brightness down to 0, you can see everything goes black. If I brought the brightness down to 100, everything goes white, right? So your brightness just adjusts the white point of your painting. So it makes everything look very faded, or it makes everything look super, super dark. However, it doesn't really adjust your values. If I wanted to adjust my values, that is a separate function. I believe it's Control L with our levels palette. So you can see right now the levels palette in Medibang is very basic. Usually the levels and curves in Photoshop are a lot more advanced, but a very basic way to adjust your levels is with the input and output. Okay, so with your input and output, basically if I drag the arrows to either side, it restores the levels to the original. But if I wanted to add more contrast, I can drag these arrows, which makes the darks darker and it makes the lights lighter. So right now this has a lot more value contrast than before, right? So compared with my original, this has a lot more contrast in value. Now with my output, basically it will act similar to brightness, right? So I can adjust my black point and my white point and manipulate the brightness in tandem with the value. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an upload. If you'd like to support the channel and the creation of free arts education, become a member on Patreon for behind-the-scenes perks and online classes at Wing Canvas. Join our Art Nerd community with the links down below. Here are some other videos you can check out next.